Ships of the world, start your engines. That was Donald Trump, just 2 days ago, announcing what he called a great deal with Iran. After more than 100 days of war, a naval blockade, mines in one of the most critical shipping lanes on Earth, and the very real threat of nuclear weapons, the U.S. and Iran have reached a ceasefire framework and a memorandum of understanding. Oil markets jumped, world leaders cheered, ships started moving. But here's the thing nobody's talking about. This deal is held together with duct tape. The most critical issues, Iran's nuclear program, uranium stockpiles, sanctions, are unresolved and packed into a 60-day negotiating window that experts are already calling nearly impossible. So today we're going to answer the question everyone should be asking. What actually happens if Iran breaks this deal? Stick around because the answer will absolutely shock you. Before we get to the consequences, you need to understand what's actually on the table, because it's both more fragile and more significant than most headlines are letting on. Just 2 days ago, on June 15th, 2026, the United States and Iran announced an initial framework agreement, a memorandum of understanding, to end what became known as the 2026 Iran War. This wasn't some quiet diplomatic handshake. This came after months of active conflict, including strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei by U.S. and Israeli forces back in February, and Iran mining and blockading the Strait of Hormuz, cutting off roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply. Here's what the MOU actually includes. A 60-day ceasefire extension, giving both sides time to negotiate a final deal. Reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, pending mine removal with a formal signing ceremony in Geneva. Iran made a verbal commitment to never pursue nuclear weapons. The U.S. agreed to negotiate over sanctions relief and potentially unfreezing up to $24 billion in frozen Iranian assets. Fighting in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah is supposed to stop immediately. Now, notice what's not in there. A final agreement on uranium enrichment, a verified dismantling of Iran's nuclear stockpile, a permanent peace. The nuclear questions, according to Axios, are specifically being left to be negotiated over the next 2 months. That's a 60-day clock on one of the most complex and dangerous geopolitical issues in the world. Some U.S. hawks are already openly worried there will never be a final deal. So what happens if the clock runs out? To understand the stakes, you need to know where Iran's nuclear program actually stands right now. And it is alarming. Back when the original 2015 nuclear deal, called the JCPOA, was in place, Iran's breakout time, meaning the time it would take to produce enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon, was over 12 months. That was the whole point. You buy time, you see it coming, you respond. When Trump pulled the U.S. out of that deal in 2018, Iran started dismantling those restrictions piece by piece. By early 2026, Iran had enriched uranium to 60% purity. Weapons grade is 90%, with a stockpile of over 400 kilograms of that material. Advanced centrifuges were spinning. The IAEA had been blocked from key facilities, and Iran had been conducting experiments with uranium metal, a key component of a nuclear warhead. The breakout time had shrunk to weeks. Israel's strikes in June 2025 damaged facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo, Iran's main enrichment sites. That set things back. But here's the terrifying reality. Iran still has the knowledge, the infrastructure, and the enriched material. A November 2025 report said Iran had paused enrichment, but by that point inspectors couldn't even access the damaged sites to verify it. So if Iran breaks this new MOU, if the 60-day window passes without agreement and Iran restarts enrichment, we're not talking about starting from scratch. We're talking about a country that could potentially sprint to a nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks. Trump has already said publicly that if negotiations fail, the U.S. could relaunch attacks on Iran. He also floated the idea of making the U.S. the guardian of the Middle East in exchange for 20% of the region's revenues, which, by the way, was not subtle. Let's talk about the one thing that made the entire world pay attention, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the single most important oil shipping lane on Earth. Before the war, roughly one-fifth of all global oil and liquefied natural gas passed through it every single day. Saudi oil, Emirati oil, Iraqi oil, Kuwaiti oil, Qatar's LNG that heats homes in Europe and Japan, all of it funneled through this one strait. Iran mined it, blockaded it, and the U.S. responded with a naval blockade of Iranian ports. The result? A global energy crisis that sent oil prices skyrocketing and rattled economies from Europe to Asia. The MOU specifically calls for Iran to clear the mines it deployed and reopen the strait. Trump said ships could only start moving upon the signing of the deal on Friday for purposes of mine removal. Now, what happens if Iran drags its feet on that? Or worse, what if the 60-day talks collapse and Iran threatens to reclose the strait as leverage? You're looking at another immediate oil price spike. You're looking at supply chain disruptions that make the 2021 shortages look like a warm-up. Europe, which is already trying to wean itself off Russian energy, would face a dual crisis. Japan and South Korea, almost entirely dependent on Gulf oil, would be in a severe economic emergency, and the U.S., even with domestic oil production, would feel it at the gas pump within days. One Iranian parliament spokesman has already said Iran will not agree to extend the ceasefire if it doesn't include Iranian control of the strait. That's a massive red flag hiding in plain sight. Now let's talk money, because the financial dimension of an Iranian breakdown is just as catastrophic. The snapback sanctions were already reimposed by the UN back in September 2025. Travel bans, asset freezes, financial sector restrictions, trade embargoes. The EU followed the very same day. China and Russia rejected the sanctions, calling them null and void, but every Western nation and most of the international banking system fell in line. The current MOU holds out the possibility of unfreezing up to $24 billion in Iranian assets and issuing sanctions waivers so Iran can sell oil freely again. Iran's economy is in free fall. It desperately needs that money. But here's the leverage problem. Iran's deputy foreign minister has said the 60-day nuclear negotiations can't even begin until the U.S. releases the frozen funds first. The U.S. flatly dismissed that demand. The principle Trump's team has been insisting on is called relief for performance. Iran gets relief only when it demonstrably complies. If that standoff continues and no deal is reached, those sanctions don't just stay in place. There will be enormous political pressure to tighten them further. And any company or country that tries to do business with Iran risks being cut off from the U.S. financial system and the SWIFT banking network. For most of the world, that's simply not a risk worth taking. The economic isolation Iran would face in a deal breakdown scenario is essentially total. We cannot talk about this deal breaking down without talking about Israel, the wild card that nearly torpedoed this agreement before it was even signed. Hours before the expected signing, Israel struck Hezbollah targets in Beirut. Iran made operational preparations to attack Israel in response. U.S., Qatari, and Pakistani negotiators scrambled in a frantic last-minute effort to keep Iran from launching, and somehow Tehran held off. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has expressed serious reservations about the deal. Israel's concerns are specific. Any agreement that leaves Iran with enrichment capabilities, even civilian ones, is unacceptable to them. They've seen Iran go from a 12-month breakout time to weeks. They struck Iranian nuclear and military sites twice, in June 2025 and again in February 2026. Their position, simply put, is that they will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, deal or no deal. Here's the nightmare scenario. The 60-day talks stall. Iran refuses to fully dismantle its enrichment program. The U.S. and Iran can't agree on sequencing, who gives what and when. Israel, watching the clock run down, decides the diplomatic window has closed and launches preemptive strikes on what's left of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That would immediately pull the U.S. back in. It would likely trigger Iranian retaliation, potentially at U.S. bases in the region or through its remaining proxy networks. The Strait of Hormuz gets mined again, and we're back to square one. except with even more damage, even higher stakes, and even less trust on all sides.
Here's where things stand as of today, June 17, 2026. A deal exists. Barely. It's a memorandum of understanding, not a signed final agreement. The signing ceremony in Geneva is still scheduled for Friday. The Strait of Hormuz is days away from reopening. Oil markets are cautiously optimistic. World leaders are exhaling. But the real negotiation, the one about nuclear enrichment levels, uranium stockpiles, sanctions, frozen assets, and the long-term fate of Iran's nuclear program, that hasn't even started yet. It has 60 days to happen. And if it doesn't, the consequences cascade fast. A nuclear sprint, an energy shock, total financial isolation, and the very real possibility of another round of military strikes. Trump has said it himself. If no deal is reached, he could relaunch attacks. And Iran's own parliament spokesman has already drawn red lines on the strait. Both sides are holding hammers, and the table between them is made of glass. The world is holding its breath, and the next 60 days will determine whether this is the beginning of peace or just the intermission of war. If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe, because this story is moving fast and we'll be covering every development as it happens. Drop a comment below. Do you think Iran will hold up its end of this deal? Let me know.